Hey everyone, Mikki here. You're listening to Mini Mikkipedia on a Monday. And in this festive season where a lot of us are trying to do all we can to be active, be mindful about what we're eating, but still indulging in treats, what is the place of fasted cardio in this to help burn body fat and continue to maintain a lean physique? And certainly fasted cardio might certainly burn more fat. But does this mean it'll result in a leaner physique? And this is what we used to think 20 years ago, 10 years ago even, that if you get up after 7 to 8 hours sleep, your liver glycogen stores are a bit lower, you start your fasted cardio, maybe have some coffee, maybe not, you're going to end up burning more calories overall. Is that actually true? Might throw some caffeine in there as well. Is this actually an effective approach for enhancing fat loss? So the hypothesis, I did mention those lower liver glycogen stores. So the concept that fasting exercise is more effective for fat loss does come from studies indicating that exercising on an empty stomach leads to the body having to rely more on stored fat for energy. And this is because of the physiological state of the body during fasting, wherein glycogen reserves in the liver are depleted, therefore this prompts the body to utilize fat as its primary energy source. Following an overnight fast, insulin levels in the blood are markedly reduced, and insulin plays a vital role in regulating the storage of fat. In its absence, the body is more prone to releasing fatty acids from fat stores for utilization as fuel. And so this hormonal state is conducive to fat oxidation, facilitating the body's access to fat reserves during exercise. And there's a substantial body of research has demonstrated that the oxidation of fat is enhanced when exercise is undertaken in a fasted state. So in the absence of immediate carbohydrate intake, the body is compelled to utilize stored fats as an energy source. And for individuals seeking to optimize fat loss, this physiological adaptation, you would think, does appear to offer a promising means of achieving this goal. This is particularly because of those lowered glycogen levels, which are observed in the liver to be lower. Because, of course, even though you're asleep and not doing anything, your body's still maintaining its basal metabolic rate, and a lot of recovery and repair goes on overnight that does require a fuel source. And so our liver stores do tend to be depleted. And that's sort of the first place that your body will go searching for fuel. So if these are lower, your body has to tap into other fuel stores. And certainly there was some evidence, or there is evidence to support this theory that fasted cardio might be more effective for burning fat. And so there was a study in 1976 by Alborg and colleagues suggesting that the ingestion of glucose during prolonged exercise alters the metabolic response, and consuming glucose leads to increased glucose uptake and oxidation in exercising muscles. And this reduced overall fat breakdown and suppress the secretion of something called glucagon. And glucagon is a hormone which is produced by the alpha cells in the pancreas, which is there to increase blood sugar levels and stimulating the liver to break down glycogen into glucose. Alborg's research demonstrated that glucose becomes a primary fuel source over fatty acids when it's ingested during exercise, shifting the body's energy metabolism from fat to carbohydrate utilization. Therefore, the opposite is true. If you were to do it in a fasted state, you would see more fat being burned as opposed to glucose. And of course, another study in 1997 by Horowitz and colleagues demonstrated that the ingestion of carbohydrates before exercise significantly suppresses lipolysis, and that limits fat oxidation during exercise. And their findings showed that even smaller increases in insulin levels after carbohydrate consumption can reduce the breakdown of fats to the point where fat oxidation is no longer efficient. So while carbohydrate ingestion boosts glucose uptake and oxidation, it shifts the body's reliance on energy from fat to carbohydrates, particularly muscle glycogen, which becomes one of the primary fuel sources during exercise. Of course, this is in addition to the glucose that's also present in the bloodstream and that you might be taking on board. So it would stand to reason then that you would burn more fat and potentially enhance fat loss if you were to train in a fasted state. But there is a flaw in this overall hypothesis. It appears that when a particular substrate, such as fat or carbohydrates, is used as a primary energy source during a short-term workout, the body tends to rely less on that same substrate for fuel over the next 24 hours. So this claim is supported by a 2011 study by Paoli. He's actually done quite a bit of research looking at ketogenic type diets and I believe some in intermittent fasting as well. And this demonstrated that exercising after a meal resulted in higher oxygen consumption in the following hours compared to exercising in a fasted state. So therefore, you would burn more carbohydrates. Although the study did not specifically measure fat loss or changes in body fat percentage, it showed participants who were fed before exercise had elevated post-exercise oxygen consumption, which suggests an increase in energy expenditure over time. And this is interesting, of course, because overall, when you're looking to get leaner and lose body fat, you do need to have a greater energy expenditure than the calories that you put in or energy intake. So eating before training in this study showed that they had an increase in their energy expenditure. Furthermore, the study also analysed the respiratory exchange ratio, which is a key indicator of whether or not fat or carbohydrates is used as a fuel source. A lower RER indicates a greater reliance on fat, while a higher RER suggests more carbohydrate usage. So the results found that participants who exercised after eating had a significantly lower RER 12 and 24 hours post-exercise compared to those who exercised in a fasted state, which indicates that feeding before exercise shifted substrate utilization towards greater fat oxidation in the hours following the workout. Which is super interesting, right? Because, of course, part of becoming or being a fat-adapted athlete, which is a separate issue from what I'm talking about now with regards to just losing body fat, but it does require an absence of glucose throughout that session to have a lower RER throughout that session. But that might only be a 90-minute training session or even a 60-minute training session. So it's what happens in the remaining 23 hours which really does make a difference. And in this particular study, despite the fact that they may have had a higher RER during that exercise session because they had been fed first, they had a lower overall RER in the hours afterwards, suggesting that they were actually utilizing more fat as a fuel source after that exercise session. Interestingly, though, even though this is what the Paoli study found, it was only done looking at a short-term window, that 24 hours. And so if we're looking at studies that actually evaluated changes in body composition, we need to look at longer term trials. So what does research suggest when you look at people over time who train fed versus fasted? So one of the review studies available was conducted 10 years ago by Brad Schoenfeld, and he's very well published and well revered in this body composition space. His review showed that there was no significant difference between fasted and non-fasted cardio on body composition. So to look at these long-term studies, interesting, there was one study conducted by Brad Schoenfeld 10 years ago, back in 2014. And in their randomized trial, they found that there was no significant difference between fasted and non-fasted cardio on body composition. And Schoenfeld used or recruited 20 healthy young female volunteers who were randomly assigned to either a fasted group that performed aerobic exercise after an overnight fast and a fed group that consumed a meal before exercising. So both groups followed a hypocaloric diet designed to induce a 500 calorie deficit, which is a fairly significant deficit if you're someone who is just averagely active. And they had to engage in 1 hour of steady state aerobic exercise 3 times a week over a period of 4 weeks. So it was only a 4-week trial, but it was still, longer than a day. The exercise protocol was identical for both groups as well. And their diets were monitored closely to ensure that they adhered to that 500 calorie deficit. And they were given a meal replacement shake to have either before for the fed group or after exercise for the fasted group. And the key findings from the Schoenfeld study found that while both groups experienced significant reductions in body weight and fat mass as you would expect, given that 500 calorie deficit, there were no significant differences between the groups in terms of body composition changes. So both the fasted and fed groups lost a similar amount of body fat and body weight, which led the researchers to conclude that the timing of food intake in relation to aerobic exercise does not appear to have a meaningful impact on fat loss when performed under the same caloric conditions. And in this instance, it was in a calorie deficit. So it does suggest that individuals looking to reduce body fat can perform aerobic exercise based on personal preference for fasting or eating before exercise, without concern of significant differences in fat loss outcomes. Of course, in this particular study, it was a small sample size with only 10 women in each group, and the fact that the study only lasted 4 weeks, whilst longer than that one day, it does make it difficult to draw really strong conclusions from this. And all of the women in this study had an average of approximately 25% body fat. So it made them sort of in that high normal range, high healthy range. So it does make it more difficult to generalize the findings to individuals with lower body fat or leaner physiques. There was a meta-analysis in 2017 by Hackett and Hagstrom, which explored the effects of fasted versus fed exercise on weight loss and body composition across 5 studies with a total of 96 participants. So again, this is quite small actually, but it did show again that there was no significant difference between the two conditions in terms of weight loss or changes in body composition, including body fat reduction and lean mass changes. Both groups, whether fasted or fed, experienced a similar minimal changes. So again, a small sample size and a relatively short duration of studies. And a lot of the research out there hasn't really controlled for the nutritional intakes among participants, and that can totally affect overall results. So due to the limitations, obviously any of these findings should be interpreted with caution. Now, one of the things to consider is whether or not you might lose more muscle mass if you train in a fasted state. And I did a bit of a search on this on the Consensus app that basically analyzes the research in the area and gives you a consensus of what the research says. And again, there's not a ton of research here. Like this actually only drew up 5 papers, but all of the 5 papers suggested that no, performing fasted cardio does not lead to a greater loss of muscle mass compared to fed cardio. Research does indicate that body composition changes, including fat loss and muscle mass retention, are similar regardless of whether aerobics exercise is performed in a fasted or fed state. So that came from the other studies as well. So you can absolutely lose body fat when you combine aerobic exercise training with a hypercaloric diet, and it should be your preference as to whether or not you train in a fasted state versus a fed state. And indeed, there are in fact studies that show that even intermittent fasting combined with exercise, including high-intensity interval training, can maintain or even increase fat-free mass, suggesting that muscle mass is preserved. I will say, though, that some of those trials, the timing of that post-workout meal is really important. So you would work out and then you have your meal immediately afterwards. So that would not be the case necessarily if you were to work out at 6 a.m. and have your meal at 12 p.m. because you want to put that substrate in after doing your actual training or exercise. And overall, the state of it shows that any changes in muscle mass or loss in muscle mass, when you look at reviews and meta-analyses, really the changes are trivial to small. So there's no real significant difference in muscle mass changes between those two states. So it really should be that, what is your preference rather than that you're doing it or not doing it for a specific reason. Because of course the flip side is you hear all of the time that training in a fasted state is detrimental to a woman's hormones. And there truly is no good data to suggest that that's actually the case. So I would say you always want to have a think about a couple of key things for you if you want to do a fasted cardio. So one of the first things is, how do you respond to fasted cardio? Do you like the fact that you can just get up and do it and then you're done for the day, and you have time to do it in the morning and you don't have time to eat beforehand? It's probably no big deal. And indeed, we probably know people who have for decades done this. I would be mindful though that if you're someone who is wanting to compete in, say, a cycling event or a half marathon, an ultra run, etc., and it's a performance-based session, certainly training in a fed state is much better for your performance than training in a fasted state. So, and obviously I'm talking here about whether it is more beneficial from a body composition perspective to train in a fasted versus fed state. No difference. But if performance comes into it, that's when you do want to be mindful of those performance changes. And the other thing I would say about that cortisol, and I have said this before, is that just check in with yourself. If you do notice that you're dieting, you're doing fasted cardio, you have this heightened level of anxiety, you're irritable, your blood sugar is all over the show, then try training with some food on board rather than in a fasted state, because potentially that for you, hormonally, it might not be a good idea, but everybody is different. So understanding how you respond, I think, is really key. The state of the research as it is that there's no meaningful difference between training fasting or fed for your ability to burn body fat and improve body composition, but we are all different. All right, team, that's it from me. Any questions or comments, hit me up. I'm on Instagram, Threads and Twitter at Mikki Williden, Facebook at Mikki Williden Nutrition. Head to my website, mikkywilliden.com. Have a great week.